Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Eggs Podcast. Today's special guest is David Young, founder at Federated Computer. How are you, David?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for making time to do this. So let's start out maybe just kind of, I guess at the beginning, let's talk about your long and storied history in technology. So you have a really interesting background, and I think our guests or our fans would love to listen to it.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm not sort of the typical person that's in technology, but this sort of shows, what's possible. I actually did a degree in ancient Greek, so I came out of college with no technology to speak of, and more of a love for languages and especially classical languages. But I went to Wall Street and was recruited by an investment bank, worked for them, and really got into technology there. And in Wall Street, it's interesting because they use technology as a sort of competitive advantage, whether it's the different types of programs that they can write in real time to track the market. And so I got into that and founded a few different startups, moved out to Silicon Valley, was on a couple startup teams, and then founded a company called Joyent, which was a big success, really the first cloud computing company. And there, I and the team, we invented things like we were the first to offer virtual machines on the internet, first to offer containers on the internet. We came up with a development platform called Node.js, which is very widely used on the internet today. That company ultimately was sold to Samsung. Learned a lot of stuff at Joyent and in all the startups. Every startup is a great learning experience. Left Joyent and started to look around and really came to the conclusion that open source software could be the future if someone sort of put together a company that made it easier for people to adopt it. And so that's what Federated Computer is really the attempt to sort of provide anyone in business or teams the ability to sort of adopt these great open source packages without needing to have an IT person on the staff to run it for them.
Oh, I love that. Well, so there's a ton of stuff I'd like to cover with you. I mean, a big part of it, would be just kind of going through your entrepreneurial journey. I mean, obviously you don't sound like you're run-of-the-mill entrepreneur. It sounds like something that maybe you came into naturally through your experience in working on Wall Street and places like that. Can you talk about maybe that first venture and getting going? I mean, it sounds like maybe it was you and other technologists that spun up that company together, maybe not necessarily business people. So what was that journey like for you in creating Joyent?
Yeah, so after I left Solomon Brothers, I joined a company called Mercury Inc., and that was really a company that was then rebranded as Managed Star. And it was in the very first sort of wave of SaaS companies. Our product was designed for managing business process, especially around construction. And that was a great time. We had some really good success. We had a bunch of big construction projects run on Managed Star. But it was a time before really the internet and cloud computing. And, I learned a lot about helping to build a team. I was the CTO there, how to build a great engineering team, just learned a lot of stuff. And the founding team there were a couple of brothers that were fantastic to work with. And I learned a lot from them, how to raise money, how to go to venture capitalists and raise the money. And that was, I remember my first VC meeting just being scared shitless. I was just like, I'm going to say something wrong. And you just sort of learn, what is the sort of power dynamic? What's the relationship dynamics between you and your investors? And I learned a lot about that. And it was a great experience. Now, at a certain point, the company started to fail, and I left the business, and I sort of took sort of some of the things that were missing for us as technologists building the software. It was very difficult at the time to get data center space, to get rack space, to get servers racked and ready to go. And so I started to think, there's some great open source projects out there. They weren't really products. Could I put these together into something that might be, available over the cloud? And I needed this because I wanted this for a startup idea that I had. And so I was talking to a couple of the colleagues that I had from Managed Art. I said, what if we did these things and we started selling this product, and that's what became Joyent. And what I learned there is, the best sort of product for me, and I'll just say it for me, but I've heard this from others, the best sort of product for me as an entrepreneur to work on is a product I want for myself. If there's a burning need for me, I say, I wish such and such a product, I wish there was a way that I could go onto the web, and just like it's easy to buy a book from Amazon, I could buy a data center, a virtual data center. So what would be required to get that done? And that's, how the cloud was born.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, I can't just, there's this thing playing around in my head, which is this, as you mentioned at the top, you studied, ancient Greece before you got
Ancient
into,
Greek, yeah,
before you
classics.
got into technology. But I wonder, how did that training actually maybe prepare you for this? So especially, given the time frame you're talking about, you're kind of in the burgeoning era of, different web languages, different, all that kind of stuff coming up. It seems like maybe your mind was sort of attuned for language. I mean, obviously there's a level of interest, or something that I wonder if there wasn't I don't know, like a compelling relationship between your, interest in Greek language and understanding, the construction of language, and being able to apply that in a technical space. So even though it seems kind of, diametrically opposed from one another, I wonder if there isn't actually something in that set of skills or that set of interests that really helped you find a way in technology.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought a lot about this, and I really think that, there's a movement that has been gaining steam. And one of the investors in Joyent was a fellow named Peter Thiel, and he pays people not to go to college because he thinks that college is a real waste of time. I happen to agree with him, but I don't agree with the sort of the method. I think that college can be a tremendous value for people, not for everyone. That I think Peter is onto something there, and I think it's a scam because oftentimes we treat college or we treat education as sort of a preparation for a specific task. We want to be doctors, so we do pre-med. We want to be engineers, so we do engineering. We want to do software development, so we do computer science. And so we treat our education as sort of a preparation, a very practical preparation for something we need to do. But in fact, I take a different view, and I think that especially in college, it's very, very important to sort of pursue much more abstract skills, things like writing, things like the ability to think, things like the ability to sort of do syllogisms, think logically, sort of, maybe. And this is why typically in the past, say prior to the World War II, you went to college and you did things like history. You did what are called the liberal arts. And the liberal arts have nothing to do with politics. It's not a question of liberal or conservative. It comes from the word liber in Latin, meaning this is the sort of education we're going to give to a free man. Liberal meaning the freedom arts, the arts to live a free life. And it's interesting because so many people are interested in sort of this question of sovereignty and sort of self-sovereignty and self-actuation. And I think, these sorts of skills like classical languages, history, philosophy, even things like theology, where you start to think about these things that are way outside of your comfort level, can be stretching and improving sort of exercises that then when you get into a place where you need to be able to have those skills of thinking and writing and expressing yourself and thinking through, you have all these sort of great experiences reading the literature, the sort of history, the sort of things that you can bring these experiences in a way that you wouldn't if you just sort of stuck to pre-medicine or engineering or those sorts of sort of like business curricula. Now I understand why people don't do it today because there's a lot of nervousness. Sort of like, oh my gosh, if I don't get this certificate or this degree, then I'm going to go to this organization, and they frankly they reject you because you don't have the credentials. But I think this is also short-sighted on the part of businesses. I was very lucky because I loved the classics. I loved history. I loved philosophy. So that's what I did in college. And I had parents that sort of, I guess, didn't give a shit, and said, hey, do what's you. And that's what I did. And then I was sort of lucky at the end of it that I was able to connect with a job where they still valued these things from a standpoint of, that was diversity for them at the time. They said, we're going to get a few quants, and then we're going to get a couple David Youngs that sort of think in a crazy way. And that's sort of how I got in. Once I got in, then because I had these sort of skills of thinking and expressing and all the rest of it, frankly, the computer science part, that stuff was easy. That was really like
Yeah.
just a question of learning the rules, just learning how it's done, and I enjoy it because technology is this amazing thing where you're writing a story and you're writing a narrative for customers, and you use the technology tools as sort of the practical ways to sort of write that story for your customers. And so I think that's what's really attracted me and kept me in technology, is sort of being able to create these stories for customers.
Well, I really love that. And I mean, this conversation is actually really fresh for us, just in that we have a recent high school graduate, just graduated a month ago, or well, not even a couple weeks ago, and is off to college in the fall. And he's considering law. And this is one of the things that we keep talking about is, so my wife is a public education teacher. She's the head of her English department, but she is the type of person who knew at a young age that she wanted to go into education. She became a teacher, or went to college, went down the line, became a teacher, did all the things, and got right into teaching. Right. So she's like the direct line from this is what I want to do to this is what I'm going to do. And she's a
Sure,
perfect
sure.
example of the college student. Right.
Right,
So then there's somebody like me who fiddled around with school, went in and out, left school to go start my business, came back during COVID, finished my degree. So over 20 some years, I finished my
wow.
degree. And then I finally finished it in hopes of maybe going back and doing like a master's in finance or something, because I'm terrible at business, but I'm really good at art.
Right,
And so I'm a super creative guy, but I'm not the best at running my own business. And so I'd like to get better. So I finished my degree for the purpose of maybe getting something else. But like now, like even now today, recently I've been looking at MBA programs and stuff like that. But it's like, I don't need the internship. I'm not going to go work on Wall Street. I don't need any of
right,
that. But
right,
so it's for my own edification, right? But I can see that the system isn't really built for that. It's got this direct line that you're talking about, which is, if you're going to be a doctor, you go to pre-med or whatever, So me trying to take an MBA in finance is like, oh, well, you're going to Wall Street, so this is what you
right,
need that for,
right.
and this
Exactly.
idea that you need it for yourself or for your own edification is, or maybe I don't even need it, is, is the big question with college. And so even with our kid, we're concerned, and I mean, I don't know how much of the media is to be believed, but there is a lot of discussion about what goes on in college campuses these days and things like that. And I think as a young parent, with a young kid, that leaves us a little bit concerned. But in his case, if he wants to go into law, then pre-law is the path.
Yeah, no,
So, I
and
mean,
I don't
so
deny that. That's right.
yeah. So this
That's
is where
right.
our struggle is too. So it's interesting hearing your story, because this is
Yeah, and you have
exactly,
to be careful here. I'm not saying everyone's like me. There's 1,000 paths, and I think that's the cool thing that you can really. We recently hired someone that came from a very good comp sci background, and we found that the person had very little practical sort of applicable comp sci um, credentialing for us, even though they came from one of the best schools. So we've had to teach them all that. But this person's been very, very successful because they're a hard worker, and it's interesting. They were homeschooled, and it's interesting about homeschooled kids is they sort of learn to sort of figure it out themselves, and they sort of
mm-hmm.
so it's a different sort of way. I was not homeschooled. I went through public school and all the rest of that. So I'm a product of public school, but I find when I come across homeschooled kids, for example, they also sort of express this characterization of sort of interest. Not everyone,
Sure.
but they express this interest in learning. And I think that's the thing that's really, really critical to sort of be able to be successful as an entrepreneur. Because, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, I don't know if everyone knows who Donald Rumsfeld is, and I don't mean to get political, but I love this sort of categorization. We have known knowns, and unknown unknowns. In entrepreneurial pursuits, it's a lot like war, where we have known things that we have to do. Like maybe we have to learn to, and I'm in the same position. I need to learn to balance and run my books better. I know I need to do that. So I can either go get education, or I can go find a partner or some outsourced person to help me with that. But then there's tons of things that even in a business, when you say this is our business plan and this is what we're going to execute on, there are tons of things that we never even consider. And we have to be sort of facile and flexible to be able to sort of figure those things out in time. And that's a key skill that I think is really, really difficult to sort of get in many of these professional programs today, at least
Well,
in my experience.
yeah, well, and it's a great point. And like, I don't know exactly how old you are, but we're more or less contemporary, I think. And so we're sort of the era where if you wanted to be online, you had to learn how to build it. And
Yeah,
so, even though my focus has always been more on the art side of things and marketing, advertising, things like that, um, as a young person, I was spinning up little clothing companies and things like that. And the only
right,
way for me to get online was to learn a little HTML or a little
right,
PHP or build a
right.
WordPress site or whatever. And so kind of what you're describing here is basically, I think people like us or sort of our age had the benefit, if you want to call it that, of being forced to learn things in order to do the things that we wanted, right? And that's that skill set you're talking about.
Yeah,
Where
and
I
I
look
think
at
if
kids
I
like,
can interrupt, I think another thing is I have girls that are in their late teens, early 20s, and everything's online today. Part of my success is because after college I moved to New York City. And so I was in this big mixing pool of talents and people. And, the same is true for LA. Big cities are amazing. And, so much of that is removed from our experience because everything's online and virtual.
hmm yeah, and I would just sort of add to that. The one thing I always mention to our kids, think of themselves as being really tech savvy because they understand, they know how to use a platform or they know how to use a
Right.
device. But the reality is, or the joke I always make is that, well, our generation built it so that you guys didn't have to learn how, right?
Exactly.
And so you guys can just, some really smart UI guy somewhere built that in such a way that you don't have to know anything to know how to run that platform. But the underlying technology is going to be a mystery to you. May as well be magic.
That's right.
And so, so that, not unlike, living in a big city or being exposed to all these different people of different talents and things like that, the sheltered version of your life where you just live within the, operating system, for example, but you don't understand how it works, you're almost denying yourself the education of understanding how all these things go together. And I've found that just in my own career, and especially now with AI development and my ability to make my own MVPs now without employing whole dev teams and stuff like
Right.
that,
Right.
I found that foundational knowledge that I got has been a real benefit just by virtue of, and I'm not like a high level developer. I'm not working in tech at the level that you have, for example, but even the little bit I know from running software teams or from, managing teams that were doing that kind of thing, building software applications has given me enough insight to be able to build some things, not without mistakes or whatever, but I'm doing all
Hmm.
that because I have this foundational knowledge. Where I
Right.
look at my son, for example, and I don't think that's where he's at, and so I see that as sort of unfortunate. But I think it's kind of a parallel between the scrapper or what we call kind of the bootstrapped version of education, where you're forced to do things, and this is what I would consider sort of the entrepreneurial journey,
Yeah.
versus somebody who goes to school and is trained to be a business person, and then he and his Harvard grad buddies start a business together, and they've all, it's like it's a little different thing. So there's, different versions for different people or anything, but I just think it's kind of an interesting observation.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's not one size fits all. I always say, you're an entrepreneur and you've lived the entrepreneur life when you go into Starbucks and you sort of look at the barista and say, I wonder how it'd be to live like a barista. It sounds pretty good because, entrepreneurial life is tough. There's a lot of arrows that we have to, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of arrows. It's not just sort of showing up for a job and then at 5 p.m. you just sort of check out. You're thinking about it all the time. And so it does definitely take a different type of personality. um, but I think what we've been talking about is very, very important, that you also need to sort of put yourself, it's hard to be an entrepreneur if you're not putting yourself in the way of learning different things, meeting different people, all these sorts of things. And I'm an introvert. This is something that I've had to really work on, which is, when I go to one of these networking things, to actually go around and sort of talk to people. That's something that's hard for me. But you can learn these skills, you can get better at them, and that's the beauty of in my experience, being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and it's also one of the things I like to point out, especially to young people, is just that there isn't a way, right? And I think
Right,
there's a lot of people who stand around and wait for a path or wait for somebody to kind of give them the direction of where to go. But the reality is there is no path. And I always use this stupid clunky phrase, but it's this idea that, it's taken every step I've ever taken to get to where I am today. Right.
right,
And the
nice,
idea is that there was no misstep, there was no wrong turn, there was no whatever, but I don't get to where I am this moment today without every prior step. Right. And
right.
so, and I think, or at least for me, that helps me stave off regrets and things like that. But I do think for most people who are just looking for a path or waiting for somebody to tell them the way, I think the beautiful thing about what we're describing is that, there's something for everyone. Whatever your path is, you can find it.
That's right. That's right.
So let's switch gears a little bit. And I want to talk about just sort of innovation. So, not to bring back the Greeks, but, obviously they're a, ancient civilization, but I think a lot of people would still consider, many of the innovations and things that they've come up with as being sort of modern ideas, even though they're ancient ideas. And so I wonder if you talk about just innovation in your own path, as you guys are discovering things like cloud computing and Node.js, which I'm familiar with now as a vibe coder, they call us. But
Okay.
so even in my own very minimal programming existence, I'm using Node.js. But maybe talk about just sort of replacing old thinking with new possibilities, understanding that maybe sometimes the old things are the new things.
Yeah, so I agree with you. The Greeks are amazing. I mean, there's no idea that's out there today that some Greek, 3,000, 2,000 years ago didn't think about it first. And that's really true. But the case of innovation is, really, as I mentioned earlier, starts with sort of, well, what would I want for myself? And then sort of figuring out how you go about getting that. And in the case of a federated computer, really the idea here is we're not innovating on the way of we're delivering the software. It's still SaaS software. But what we're innovating on is we've come up with this idea of we're the first Linux distribution in the cloud, meaning we're putting everything together that you might want in your software collection. We're making it all work together. We're doing everything that you expect as far as backing up and all the rest of that. And that's what we're doing. Now, many people often, when they come across the federated computer idea, they're like, well, that's pretty freaking obvious. I mean, so where's the innovation in that? And sort of the striking thing about innovation is oftentimes, like a good joke, it's pretty obvious. And that comes back to what I started with, is like, well, this is something I'd want for myself. So if I want it for myself, it's pretty obvious. You oftentimes can be very, very successful doing something, like what would be another example, like Uber, cars that you're renting someone else's cars. Hey, that sounds obvious. If you can figure it out, that sounds obvious. These are things that are not really like innovations in the sense of new science, but they're business models and packaging together of existing things that didn't exist before, but are very, very valuable to customers. The sort of third part of innovation, so I want it, it's going to be pretty obvious. The third part is I want to get that to customers, potential customers, as quickly as possible to see what they think. And so I'm a big believer in sort of getting your business up and running and trying to sell quickly, because customers are going to tell you if you're diluted. And I've been involved in those situations where the best sort of gift you can get from customers is a resounding no. If customers say no, we don't like this, they're saving you a lot of time and effort. It's rare that they say yes in a resounding way, in my experience. The worst thing is when you get lots of mixed messages and you don't quite know. But one of the ways that you deal with this is sort of the fourth thing, which is you sort of narrow it down as much as possible. The thing that you're working on, that innovation, you narrow it down to a single hill. So you're trying not to solve a bunch of problems or a bunch of innovations at once. You're trying to solve a single thing. And so in the case of federated computer, our single thing is sort of integration. That's what we're doing. We're not doing, people will sometimes come to our product and say, oh, well, you're gluing together these different pieces of software. I wish the user interface was the same. That's not a problem right now. Our problem is integration. And if we do the integration really, really well, the customers come along. And that's in fact what we've discovered is we've been able to sign up thousands of customers because we're solving that one part, which was the integration. That's what was missing for them. So that's how I see innovation. I have been involved on teams where we fundamentally come up with a new way of thinking, the Node.js thing. But then again, it's sort of, if you take Node.js and go through this pattern, it was the same thing. At Joint, we had millions of servers. We couldn't keep on top of all the data. So we came up with a solution which allowed us in real time to keep up with all the data that was coming from all these servers, but a language that was compiled in real time that performed like a compiled language like C. Now, I know that's somewhat technical, but we needed it. That's the point. So we solved it for our own need. And then as we sort of went through the process, we focused on the single hill, the single thing that we could solve. We asked customers, hey, would this be useful to them? And, we went through the whole process and it was very, very successful. So this is the sort of way that I think of innovation. There's a lot of innovation out there where people are coming up with, pretty brilliant new ideas, but they don't really need them for themselves. What's an example of this? I think you see a lot of this in green energy, where people are coming up with new ideas around green energy, but they're not really using it to transport themselves. This is the wonderful thing of, say, a company like Tesla or, Starlink. These are very focused, on the nose. Customers want them. They're solving a problem that, anyone, in this case, the engineers at those companies would want. And so you get sort of the back end of this, which is product success and entrepreneurial success.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of my big jokes right now, or one of the things that I'm constantly pointing out, is right now in sort of the AI revolution, how
Yeah,
quickly people are just bolting AI onto their platforms, but they're not really doing
exactly.
anything new or innovative. It's like, okay, you can type a paragraph faster or you can do whatever, but it's like, it's not meaningful change. So you're using this technology that, has the potential to be really, a global shift, but then you use it in the most arbitrary ways. And so to your point about, they don't really need it. It's just the trend is we hurry and slap AI on our thing. And so
Right,
every
right.
application charges 10 more bucks a month now when you get AI. So I agree with
I
that.
think
But
that's a great example. And, going back to the Greeks, they had a group of people called the sophists, and the sophists were really good at selling things that no one really needed, but they were really good at selling it. And so they made a lot of money. But you can think even in our current day, there's a lot of people out there that are really good at sort of pumping stuff. I guess that would be the current word for it, right?
yeah,
Pumping stuff, getting that profit. I've never really been very good at pumping. And I'm not just sort of saying that to say, hey, I'm a reliable person. I've just never been really good at pumping. It's an exhausting process, if you ask me. And I much prefer to spend my time sort of focusing on getting the innovation right, getting the hill right, getting the customer reaction right, and then delivering that and executing that through to the end.
yeah, yeah. I'm a little bit more that way too. In fact, I call myself a sort of a persistent starter, but I'm not much of a finisher. So I have a million great ideas, and I build them out to the point that they're ready to do something, and then I just stop. I run into a wall. So that's something I got to overcome. But
Yeah, but that's the thing about entrepreneur. That's one of the wonderful things about entrepreneurial life is we don't have to do everything. We can learn to work with other people. So we can find, and this is something I've learned about being an entrepreneur is I don't have to be the everything guy. In fact, a measure of my success is more hats that I take off and find someone that does engineering better than I do, someone that does marketing and sales better than I do. And so it's a very team sport in my experience. Yeah, there's always sort of the initial, pain and sort of loneliness of being that initial entrepreneur. But one of the things that I really love about it is that sort of first 10, 15 colleagues where people are coming on board. We're all vibing like, not vibing in the sense that you've talked about vibe programming, but vibing like a band, where we're sort of I'm the drums and you're the bass and this and that. There's all sorts of ways to talk about this from an analogy, but that is a really cool thing to see when that comes together well.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've always considered myself kind of a connector. Like I'm really good at putting people together. But to
Right.
your point about not being much of a pumper, I too am not much of a pumper, and so I would rather connect to other people than connect myself to someone else.
That's right.
And that's probably the skill that I need to master next because, like I say, I get things all the way to the point of we have a website and we're ready to go, but then it just dies on the vine because I don't pursue it or I don't chase down people, and then I can't do it all myself.
You
So
need
we
to
run into
find an
issues with that.
execute. You need to find a yin for your yang,
Yeah,
and
you're
then you're
not
going to be
kidding.
unstoppable.
Well, we're working on it. We'll see if we can find somebody. I wanted to extrapolate or expand a little bit your idea of building for yourself, or sort of this notion that, a lot of times we find more passion if we're doing the build for ourselves, or if we are solving a need that we've got ourselves. And this is hitting close to home too, just with the recent graduate who wanted to play college football. We spent a lot of time trying to get him recruited over the last couple of years. And we saw all the problems with the way people currently do recruiting. So my big push lately has been to build this new recruiting platform and all these other things that go with it. And so I'm building that for me, and I don't really have any idea if it will be accepted in the market or whatever, but it's a tool that I can use. So what I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned building for yourself, but I wonder when we start to try and be, maybe a little more professional with these things or take them to the next level, and you've got to do some vetting. You hear a lot of people, and for me this sounds like famous last words, but a lot of people say, you need to do the vetting, or you need to understand, how your product is going to play in the market, maybe before you even build it, right? You should be pressure testing these ideas and things like that before you really go forward with them. And for me, that sounds like a non-starter. Like I'm afraid that I would get advice, or I could get an opinion that was like, it's a dumb idea, nobody's going to do it, and I'd just stop.
Right. Right.
So I wonder if you could just sort of talk about, in your mind, vetting an idea and doing something for yourself, building for you, and then just going with the flow and letting the chips fall. Or, is it good to, like, I guess, when should you trust yourself, or when should you trust other people?
Yeah. So people toss around this term MVP all the time, and I think in common parlance today, MVP means something where I could show it to someone else and they could get my idea. For me, MVP means someone's ready to pay money. So minimal viable payment. Let's just talk it that way. A product is only a product if someone's willing to pay for it. And so you need to sort of get your product done so that you can charge for it. It's not going to be complete, but you need to have enough value there that someone's going to charge for it. And if someone doesn't want to, sorry, someone wants to pay for it. If someone doesn't want to pay for it, then you don't have a product. I mean, it sort of sounds obvious, but I think people miss this, and people sort of escape this in some ways, and it's a little bit of lazy thinking. They say, "Well, we'll just make it free. We'll make it free, and then at some point we'll figure out the business model." It's like, well, yes, I'm not denying that that doesn't work out in some cases, but let me give you a concrete example where I saw this from the front row. Twitter, now called X. They started on Joyent, my cloud company, and those guys had an amazing product, but they didn't know what the product was. So they went through a lot of pain, a lot of sort of engineering pain, a lot of product pain, a lot of vicissitudes of sort of, what is this product? Is it? And it turned out, they sort of backed into advertising. I think it's really, really important because most folks were not going to capture lightning in the bottle like Twitter did. At South by Southwest, when people said, "Oh, this is a great way to keep in touch with each other." So you need to sort of figure out what is someone paying for and build to that. And if you can achieve getting people to pay, doesn't have to be a lot of people, 10, 15, 20 people to pay for your product, then you're off to the races. And the customers, because prior to that, I think your intuition is right. They don't really know. They don't really know your vision, and they're going to give you maybe bad information about what they think really about your product. But when someone has to actually put money on the table, then they're going to be honest with you. It's just sort of one of those things that I've seen. That's why I like to sort of ask for money. In fact, I like to even go further, and I always like to try and figure out a way that I can sell a lifetime version. So, hey, if you pay me this amount of money, you're going to get a lifetime version of this product. Now, that's not possible for every product. I understand that, especially if you're selling something like a t-shirt. I don't know what a lifetime version of a t-shirt would be, but you sort of really have to get the customer to come to terms with you and say, I value this. And the best way to sort of show value is by exchanging money.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's a really good point, actually. I had a meeting recently with a guy um, about this, little venture that I'm trying to build up right now, this sports marketing thing. And his response was like, well, it seems good, but there's a lot of people doing that right now. Like, there's like no place for you. Right. And so my initial impulse was like, well, bummer, I guess like I've wasted all this time building this thing, but I think back to our point earlier, there really is a place for everybody. There's plenty of humans out there. There's people who will
Yeah.
appreciate our approach or our methodology versus others, and, or a price point or our whatever, so I think it's good to, maybe hear other people's advice and try and take it as constructive criticism. But I think it's a really good point you make that just, they're not going to capture your vision. They're not going to do whatever, but on its most, practical level, can they see what you're doing? And is it worth me giving you $5?
Now, it's very important at the point when you start to take your product out to customers that you take off what I call your happy years. Because your happy years as entrepreneurs, we are faced with a lot of rejection. So we're out there sort of looking for any positive thing. And everyone is susceptible to this. I just went through a 15-month process with a customer, and I finally broke it off. And I was thinking about it, it's like I had happy years on. I was constantly deluding myself about what this customer was really looking for. And so consequently, I kept on engaging when, probably 12 months ago, I should have said, you know what? We're never going to be able to solve your problem. So thank you for your time. So it's really important to listen to that feedback you get from customers, paying customers, and take it to heart, not to sort of say, oh, I'm going to interpret this in a way that makes me feel better, but sort of figure it out. Now, you have to be careful because on the other side, if you're building a product, you don't want the customer, like you said, you don't want them to sort of start dragging you in one direction. You mentioned a recruiting product. Well, you're doing a recruiting product. You don't want that suddenly to become a school testing product, just to sort of bolt on a ridiculous sort of, orthogonal piece of feature. So you're only going to get this over time. And again, in my experience, it's really difficult to do it individually. That's why I always like, personally, as an entrepreneur, I like to have a co-founder, because then I can have this sort of, it's almost like being a spouse, in a healthy marriage. Healthy marriages, I'm married. If I talk to my spouse, things go a lot better. If I talk to my co-founder and the people that are my colleagues, things go a lot better, because then we're not self-deluding and we're actually all listening, and we're trying to sort of get the thing and then figure out, how are we going to move this product in a way that more people are going to be willing to pay for it.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that too. And it's, in my experience, like it's the one thing I miss about working inside traditional ad agencies and things like that
Yeah,
is being surrounded by the team.
right.
I basically work from home now. All our team is remote and we just talk to everybody through Slack and things like that. But it's not the same as having like a person to talk to. And it doesn't mean they have to be in your room all the time, but I don't have like a counterpart. You know what I mean? Like I have people that I delegate work to and things like
Well, you
that.
can always reach out to
But
me. I'll talk to you.
well, I appreciate it. I feel like you and me have a bunch in common. I wonder though, so I want to just kind of keep pushing down this path about, when is right to do things for you and when it's right to do things for others, which is, you always hear people in sort of entrepreneurial circles talking about if you can chase your passion or, and maybe not even entrepreneurial circles, just in general, as far as it pertains to work, if you can do something you're passionate about, it's a lot easier to do. But then there are people who chase their passion and end up staying at mom's basement until they're well into
Right,
their 40s
right,
and 50s. So, because if their passion is Minecraft or something, they may never get, outside of that passion. So
right.
I wonder if you talk a little bit about just sort of pursuing the right thing or the thing you're passionate about, or sort of parsing out what are the things that are worth chasing down in a business realm, and when it's
Right.
okay to maybe you do something as a hobby, but like it's okay to do the things that you want to do, but how do you parse out what's the passion project and what's the thing you should actually pursue?
Yeah, it's a great question because I do have hobbies. I think it's really important, especially as entrepreneurs, not to just be stuck to the computer working on the same. You have to get away. You have to sort of. And I was just talking with one of my investors recently about this issue that it's really important to get away and have that sort of space from the project, even the passion project. um, you know, ultimately, if the project is going to be a business, I think my answer would be it comes back to that pay. You so I do have a concrete example of failure. After Joyent, I was so tired of the cloud, and thought that I'd really done as much as I wanted to do in the cloud, and there wasn't really something new. So I had this bright idea. It was really born from arrogance. I thought I'll start an ice cream company, and it was called Honeymoon Ice Cream. And we had great ice cream. It was Jersey milk, which is the best milk. We made all of our candies, all of our jams, and it was in a glass jar. It was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful product. I mean, on the shelf, maybe you've seen Talenti, which is in a plastic jar, but
Hmm.
it just swirls and it looked beautiful. And we had this, and we ended up in almost 2,000 grocery stores throughout the Western United States. So it was a real eye opener, because food is very, very tough. Um, but I had a business partner, and he and I were working at it. We were, moving it into new grocery stores and all sorts of great growth. But the both of us just hated it. We hated it. We were doing this and we had found success, but we just sort of didn't like, we had a sense, and again, this came from our experience in part, we had a sense that this is not something that we wanted to do. So we ended up selling it to, our co-packer. And we were throughout California and Nevada and all the way out to Colorado, where I am today. So, I think you sort of need to do what we've been talking about, which is you sort of need to think, listen to yourself. You need to talk with people. You need to sort of figure out, we don't have forever on this earth. And there are other things besides doing business that are, there's being a parent, there's being a spouse, there's being a son, there's being a daughter, there's all these other things that are also really important that we want to spend our lives on. And so you just sort of figure that out. And I can tell you in my experience, there's no wrong answer, meaning, yeah, maybe you'll make maybe it was a terrible decision to walk away from Honeymoon Ice Cream. And maybe we should have just, sort of buckled up and gotten that done. But, that's in the rearview mirror, and you just keep on moving. Life is a series of adventures and fun. And sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's super painful, but that's life. And it's all for the good in the end. That's what I've found out.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it dovetails nicely into what I wanted to get into next. And you've talked about it a little bit in from a couple different paths already, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about when's the right time to leave or when's the right time to exit. And I think that in your experience, and we've described a couple of exits already, one being the version where you sell, one being the version where you walked away.
Yeah,
And a third, maybe, a version where you just decided it wasn't for you and you're going to walk away. So exit can mean a
yeah,
lot of things. But I think there's a lot of people who maybe overstay their welcome, right? There's a lot of folks that, do exactly what you just described, which is buckle down and do the work, even if they don't like the work.
right,
And
right.
so I wonder if you talk a little bit about just, I don't know, where in your mind or how you come up with these conclusions. Cause I think for a lot of people, fear keeps people from acting a lot of times.
Yeah,
And I think they're relegated to stay in a line of business or in a job for, maybe just for the money, or maybe because they think it's what their family expects of them or whatever. But it seems like you, at least, and I don't know if this is natural to you or if it's just simplified because we're just having a podcast conversation, but it does seem
right.
like you're sort of meandering or moving in and out of things sort of in a natural way versus, oh man, I was in that business for 10 years too long and then I walked out. It was like, you don't come to a breaking point and leave. It seems more like you're being proactive in these choices. So I wonder if you just kind of share with us a little bit of your thoughts about exiting and when's the right time.
Yeah, so it's almost impossible for me to give a principle, because every situation is different, and I'm not saying that to avoid the question. I just think that that's the case, and even in my own situations, It wasn't obvious, and sometimes you stay too long. Sometimes, there's a lot of evidence where, in the case of honeymoon, we should have left when we had 20 stores, and we shouldn't have stayed to grow it to almost 2,000 stores. We should have sort of seen, hey, this is going to be a business that is going to be really all about execution and all about margins. And the grocery business is food in general is a real grinder when it comes in. This is just not our thing. But, a little bit of arrogance got in the way there. And so I really lean on the ability to have people in your life that you can talk to. And it's not a single conversation. You need to have a sort of a series of conversations. In my case, I talk to my wife a lot. I've got a couple friends that I've had for a long time that I talk to them, and you just sort of sit with the conversations. You think about them, and the more will be revealed, as it's sometimes said, and then you will be given the right answer. But you can't stay, in my experience, you can't stay within your own head, because there's just too many conflicts of interest there. There's ego, there's desire, and you can drive yourself crazy. I know of a lady here in Colorado who wants to go do a startup, but she has a very lucrative financial practice, and she doesn't want to leave that. But she wants to. I've seen her. She desperately wants to do this startup idea. Whether it's a great idea or not, I don't know. Should she leave her lucrative financial business? Yeah, because she's miserable. She should just do it, and she'll probably fail. She'll fail at the startup, but she's going to win at the experience, if you know what I mean. And I think that's the thing, when you can see that, the experience is going to work out. No one goes to prison. We're not going to go to debtor's prison. There's always going to be a tomorrow. Then it really frees yourself up to sort of take some of those risks, whether it's leaving or starting, and sort of just do it. There's no better life than the entrepreneurial life. It's not for everyone, but it allows us to sort of get into different things and do things that. And I'm not talking about the money rewards. I'm talking about just the creative sort of ability to sort of do things. As I say, tell the story for customers. There's nothing like the entrepreneurial life, and I'm just a big believer. So let's do it.
How different are you today versus the young David Young, who, as it pertains to like risk tolerance? So, as you're talking about this, and obviously for this person you suggest, or you were talking about, they, it seems like they're in something that's somewhat comfortable, and the notion of taking this is pretty risky, or feels very risky.
Right.
And I think some people are naturally, very able to, cope with risk, and it's not that big a deal to them. And, but I, as sort of a self, reported introvert, and maybe in common with you being sort of introverted, risk aversion has always been one of these things. Like I've always managed to do things myself because I didn't want the risk of somebody else doing it.
Right. Interesting.
So, and then as I go into business, or as I try different things, I've grown and I've come out of my shell quite a bit over the years. And now I say things like what you just said, which is like, oh, well, there's no debtor's prison. You'll be fine. But, is that where you were at when you started your career, or is that maybe a byproduct of having some starts and stops over the years?
I've been accused of being wildly irresponsible when it comes to risk. So, I mean, and in a certain way, once you reach my age, I'm in my mid 50s. It's almost impossible, believe it or not. If I were to go to a big business, and I've gone to big consulting companies and said, geez, maybe I'm tired of doing this entrepreneurial thing. I'd like to come in to a big company. Almost inevitably, they reject me because I'm too risky for them. I'll never be happy. I'll never be settled. And so, personally, I need to be out there, and I love early startups when it's a few people and anything is possible. That's where I love to operate. And as you said, not everyone's that way. So in some ways, the lady that I mentioned, maybe she needs to sort of understand that the job in this case is not her life, and she needs to find something else and sort of have her sort of self-worth be based on that. I don't know. I would never be sort of pretend to give someone concrete direction like that. But, you know, I I think the best I can do is just sort of give my experience, and it's for David Young. That's all it is. And, as your question is, yeah, I love risk. I love risk. I feel like that's where I'm the most comfortable. And it's
Yeah.
insane. It really is insane, but yeah.
Well, no, but I think what's good about it is I think to your point, a lot of people's identity is wrapped up in what they do, and I see this like in my wife versus the way that I live. For example, I'm much more flippant and a little bit more like, well, yeah, we can do anything. Oh, we want to do that? Let's build it. Like, come on, let's
Right.
go. Where my wife is, as I pointed out earlier, she's a very straight line. She educates and loves to educate, and actually, she's running into trouble now because as a teacher, she's always been able to educate, but as time goes on, these school districts seem to be homogenizing education even more and more, and
Interesting.
they're actually starting to restrict her ability to teach. Like now,
Right.
it's okay,
Right.
you'll teach this, and these are the words you'll use, and this is the way you'll teach it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Where in the old days, you would rely on the creativity of a teacher. So she's
Right.
actually coming up against a little bit of a crisis because, just for the reason you mentioned, her identity is she's Tia Rogar, the teacher.
Right.
This is who she is. And where I am this weird amorphous blob of identity that, like, if you were to ask me on any given day who I am, I'd be like, well, I don't really know. This morning I feel like this.
Right.
you know?
Right.
And so we're very different personality types in that way. But I think that, in general, if we we're going to try and leave sort of a philosophical egg here, the idea is that, maybe don't become that you are not your ideas, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's interesting as you talk about your wife, my co-founders have always been like your wife. So I'm Mr. Like, let's put all the cards on the table. Let's go all in. My co-founder is like, wait a second. Let's think about this a little bit. So, it comes back to this idea of a team or a band. Like, you got to have the right people. And I like to work with people that I know, and it's not just David Young doing crazy things. I know what I know, and I know what I need to have in my life. And so, I have people that sort of put some curbs there to say, okay, great power, great vision, great what, let's push it towards a goal.
Well,
And
to use the band metaphor, I mean, you've always got the one guy that's breaking his guitar every set,
right,
but meanwhile, you've got the drummer keeping rhythm. And so
that's
you've
right.
got, it kind of takes all these different kinds of minds or all these different types of people to work together. And, I often use this phrase when I talk about sort of who I am, or whenever my wife is like, what the hell are you thinking today? It's, I always say, well, it's kind of, it's a feature, not a bug. Like this
Right,
is, I'm this way, but this is why I'm this way. And
right,
you can be your way, but this is a feature of me. I like, there's not something wrong with me because I'm this
right.
way.
Exactly,
And I
exactly.
think that, you can probably relate to that. So we're starting to wind down here a little bit. I wonder if you talk just a little bit about just sort of, or bring it back around to federated computer and, how people can start to leverage open source in their business, how they can get, really busy with that. And then maybe close on how people might get in touch with you if they're interested in doing business with you or learning more about the work you do over there.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about federated. Yeah, so the cool thing is that everything in our life today is built on open source. I mean, whatever service you might be using on the internet probably is built on a server running Linux, which is open source. But you know, open source isn't just for developers. They're now, in the case of say Zoom or Google Workplace or Airtable or Slack or all these things, there are open source equivalents. And what we do at Federated is we take all these open source equivalents and we've integrated them together so that they work really well together. It's easy to manage users, so there's a single place to manage users. Everything's backed up. The storage is unified, and all the rest of this. So the upshot for customers is a typical customer saves between $300 and $400 per employee per month when they move from their old proprietary system to federated computer. and they get all or better functionality. Now, that's not to say there isn't switching costs. You have to learn a new system, but most of us are pretty capable and able within a day or so to learn these new systems. But they get all the software, and it's a huge price savings. We're also very, very flexible because it's open source. You get to decide how you're going to use the software to mold your business rather than molding your business to some proprietary software's way of doing things. So we see customers, like we have a big dental practice in Southern California. They're now using this as a better way to reach out to customers, marketing, how they sort of see the customer touching the business and keeping in touch with the business in ways that they weren't able to do before they came to Federated Computer. But then the third benefit of Federated Computer is privacy and digital sovereignty. Most of the tools today are using our data. It's part of their business model is to use the data to sort of train an advertising model or an AI, some AI LLM. So our data is being vacuumed up. And if you've ever had that weird thing that's like, oh, I was talking to someone about such, and suddenly I'm getting advertisements for it. Well, this is something I saw firsthand because at Joyent, we actually helped launch the developer program for Facebook. And so the business model is grabbing all of our data, reselling it, building profiles, doing all these sorts of things. And open source sort of makes it so that is just not possible. At Federated Computer, there's nothing shared. Every customer has their own installation. And we really believe that digital sovereignty is something that everyone needs to be worried about, and we deliver that. So again, price, flexibility, and privacy are the reasons that people use Federated Computer. And I'm very, very encouraged because I think open source is becoming more and more used there by users. You see, people on their computers using more and more open source, whether it's video editing or podcasting. We're on Riverside today, not to give away your secrets, but a lot of people use OBS, which is another way to do, and that's an open source tool for doing things like this. So I think the future is open source. The future is people collaborating together for solutions for humanity. And that's what Federated Computer is really focused on delivering to our customers.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that focus on privacy too, because I just feel like as the internet has grown, and this maybe goes back to some of our discussion earlier about that, most of the internet users are not that tech savvy really. And so I feel like people play a little fast and loose with their privacy these days. And I think that having people that are actively looking out for that is a big deal, because it's like we almost need Papa to do that for us, because most of us aren't paying any attention.
Yeah, and so if anyone wants to get in touch, my email is david@federated.computer. I'd be happy to talk with anyone. And by the way, if you're a listener of the Eggs podcast, if you come to Federated or are interested in the product, we have a 30-day free trial. And if you use the coupon code EGGS, EGGS, we'll give you 30% off the first year. And that's pretty amazing because, for $120 a month, we have cheaper packages, but our top line package is $120 a month. You get all the software you could ever want for your business, including video conferencing that supports up to 5,000 participants. You get email, groupware, group chat. So you get a Slack replacement that's fully end-to-end encrypted and no one's looking in on your Slack chats. So use the coupon code EGGS, EGGS, and we'll give you 30% off your first year. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it, David. This has been an awesome conversation, and I love the insights. Hope you don't mind keeping you largely philosophical today, but I felt like we had a lot of stuff in common, and I think that these are all great insights for our listeners.
Oh, I love this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week, and we'll see you guys next time.